The sermon tonight is called, How Long Was Jesus Dead? How long was Jesus dead? You might think, well, that's kind of an interesting topic. It's going to be a little more of a technical sermon tonight than an ethical exhortation as we gave this morning. You know, I think both things are very important. Not only ethical exhortation to how we're to behave, but also doctrine, knowledge, understanding about what happened so that we can understand the historical facts of our faith. And so you would think, well, don't we know this? Isn't this obvious? But in fact, there's some dispute. There's a little bit of argument among people about this. How long was Jesus dead? That is, we're saying, how much time passed between his death on the cross and his resurrection from the dead? And there is the traditional view of the church, which is that he died on the sixth day of the week, what men now call Friday, and that he was raised from the dead on the first day of the week, which we call now Sunday. And that is, in fact, the correct view. That is the biblical view. So what I'm going to argue is, I'm going to argue that the traditional view, the traditional understanding, was the correct view, and that this is the biblical and scriptural view. However, there's an opposing viewpoint now. Various groups have now begun to propose that, in fact, he was not crucified on the sixth day of the week, what we call Friday, but that he was crucified on Wednesday, and that he was actually dead for 72 hours before he was resurrected on the first day of the week. And so there are various groups which advocate this alternate view, and I'm going to show that that is not correct, and that the traditional view is the correct view, because it's what the Bible actually teaches. All right, so how long was Jesus dead? The Lord Jesus used 4 expressions to describe the length of time that he would be dead. The first expression that he uses, he says that he would rise, quote, in the third day. He says he would rise, quote, in the third day. So the first expression he uses is, in the third day. We see this expression used in Matthew 16:21. Let me turn over and read that. It says, "From that time Jesus began to show to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised the third day." You know, of course, as I say, if you translate more literally, you'd say be raised in the third day or on the third day. And then this is used several times, this expression, in the third day. Matthew 16:21, Matthew 17:23. "And they will kill him, and the third day he will be raised up." Matthew 20:19. "And deliver him to the Gentiles to mock and to scourge and to crucify, and the third day he will rise again." And the third day he will rise again. Mark 9:31. "For he taught his disciples and said to them, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and after he is killed, he will rise the third day." Mark 10:34. "And they will mock him and scourge him and spit on him and kill him, and the third day he will rise again." Luke 9:22. "Saying, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised the third day." Luke 13:32. And he said to them, "Go, tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I shall be perfected." Or in the third day I shall be perfected. Luke 18:33. They will scourge him and kill him, and the third day he will rise again. Luke 24:7. Saying, "The Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and the third day rise again." Luke 24:21. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all this, today is the third day since these things happened. Luke 24:46. Then he said to them, "Thus it is written, and thus it was necessary for the Christ to suffer, and to rise from the dead the third day." Then we see Acts 10:40. Acts 10:40. Him God raised up on the third day and showed him openly. Or that's Peter, the Apostle Peter speaking. 1 Corinthians 15:4. 1 Corinthians 15:4. And that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day, according to the Scriptures. So, as you can see, that is actually the majority expression. Most of the places which speak about the timing of Jesus' resurrection say that he would rise in the third day or on the third day. However, there is another expression that is used. The second expression, which Jesus used to describe the length of time he would be dead, is he says he would rise in 3 days. In 3 days. Matthew 26:61. Matthew 26:61. It says, "And said, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days." In 3 days. Matthew 27:40. "And saying, you who destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross." Of course, I'm aware that these are not all statements of Jesus, but these are the ways in which his resurrection is being described, and they're claiming to reference back a statement that Jesus made. Mark 14:58. Mark 14:58. "We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands." Mark 15:29. "And those who passed by blasphemed him, wagging their heads and saying, Aha, you who destroy the temple and build it in 3 days." All right, John 2:19. John 2:19. And here we see the statement of Jesus that they were referencing. John 2:19. "Jesus answered and said to them, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." So see, Jesus did in fact say that. So Jesus said first, in the third day or on the third day. Second, he said in 3 days. Now what's the third expression he used? He said that he would rise, quote, after 3 days. Matthew 26:61. Matthew 26:61. Well, that was that was the same reference as in 3 days. It's 2763 then is what I'd like to look at. Let's see. Yes, 27:63. My mistake. Matthew 27:63, because that 26:61 was an in 3 days reference. Matthew 27:63, saying, Sir, we remember while he was still alive how that deceiver said, after 3 days I will rise. So you see the after 3 days. Mark 8:31. Mark 8:31. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. So, I mean, that's a clear statement from Mark, writing by the Holy Spirit, saying that he instructed them that after 3 days he would rise again. So far we've seen 3 different expressions. He said he would rise in the 3rd day. He said he would rise in 3 days. He said he would rise after 3 days. And then what is the 4th expression he used? He said that he would be in the heart of the earth, quote, 3 days and 3 nights. Matthew 12:40. Matthew 12:40. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So here he says that he would be in the heart of the earth, which what is he speaking about? He's speaking about being in hell. Now when I say hell, I do not mean the place of torment. Jesus Christ did not die and go to the place of torment. He said when he was on the cross to the thief on the cross, he said, this day you will be with me in paradise. So he did not go to the side of hell where the people were being tormented in fire. Nevertheless, he did go down to Sheol, Hades, or what we would call in English hell, which is the place of the dead in the middle of the earth. So the 4th expression is that he would be in hell, or in other words, he would be dead, quote, 3 days and 3 nights. Now it is because of that 4th expression, 3 days and 3 nights, this is where this false theory has arisen that Jesus had to have actually been dead for a full 3 days. And so therefore they've said, well look, 3 days and 3 nights, that means 72 hours. That's what the Wednesday crucifixion theory is all about. They're saying in order for him to have been dead for 3 days and 3 nights, that means that he actually had to be dead for 72 hours. 3 24-hour days. And that's why they've come up with the theory that he was crucified on Wednesday in order to make it a full 72 hours rather than on the 6th day. Okay, so we have 4 expressions giving us the timing of when Jesus would rise from the dead and how long he would be dead. Now, the problem is that when we look at these statements, in the 3rd day, in 3 days, after 3 days, and 3 days and 3 nights, these expressions look contradictory. They look contradictory. They look as if they could not all be true. Especially to the Gentile mind. To the Gentile mind, all of us here today are Gentiles. And to the Gentile mind, these things look contradictory. But because we know that the Bible does not contradict itself, we know that all 4 of these expressions must be equivalent. They must be equivalent. We know that because the Bible is God's Word, and it never contradicts itself. So knowing that the Bible cannot contradict itself, we know that they must mean the same thing. The only question is, how? How do they all mean the same thing? Now, they look contradictory. How do they look contradictory? Okay, for example, how could Jesus rise both, quote, after 3 days, and then in the 3rd day? How could he rise both after 3 days and in the 3rd day? We would think that after 3 days would mean in the 4th day, not in the 3rd. Also, how could Jesus be in hell 3 days and 3 nights? Again, we Gentiles would think that this means 72 hours. But if Jesus rose after 72 hours, then again he would have risen in the fourth day, not in the third. So what is the solution to these apparent contradictions? All right, to understand all these things correctly, you must be aware of 5 things, and that's what we're going to go through. Number 1, the Jewish way of counting. Number 2, the Jewish calendar. Number 3, the meaning of the word day in the Bible. Number 4, the Jewish way of counting days. And number 5, the Jewish use of idioms. So first, the Jewish way of counting. The Jewish way of counting. And here's how the Jewish nation counted, which is different than the way that we often count in English, which is that the Jews often counted inclusively rather than exclusively. Inclusively rather than exclusively. So let me show you an example. If you look at the Epistle of Jude, Jude 14. The Epistle of Jude. Jude, there's only one chapter of Jude, so I'm going to say Jude 14. Don't say Jude chapter 1. All right, Jude 14. What does Jude say? Now Enoch, the 7th from Adam. Enoch, the 7th from Adam. Alright, well he calls Enoch the 7th from Adam. But if you go back to the genealogy of Genesis chapter 5, you will see that the list is Adam, Seth, Enosh, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, and Enoch. So when you look at that list, if we were talking about, we were to say, well, how many from Adam was Enoch? Well, in the English way of counting, if we said from Adam, it would mean that we were not counting Adam. If we were saying from Adam, that we're not counting Adam. So that Enoch would be the 6th from Adam. If you're counting Adam, you'd say Seth, Enosh, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch. You'd say he was the 6th from Adam. But Jude calls Enoch the 7th from Adam. And this shows that Adam is counted as the first. So it's kind of funny when you're saying from Adam, in the Jewish way of speaking, you're including Adam in from Adam. Which, it kind of seems odd to us. But you've got to understand that the Jews counted inclusively rather than exclusively, making Enoch the 7th from Adam, not the 6th. Now another example of this is found in Matthew chapter 1, verse 17. Matthew says, quote, all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. Now the list that he gives is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, Perez, Hezron, Ram, Aminadab, Nahshon, Salmon, Boaz, Obed, Jesse, and David. And once again, Abraham is counted as the first, which makes David the 14th. So that he can say all the generations from Abraham to David. It's not 13th as it would be if you were counting exclusively, but it's 14th if you're counting inclusively. Now, why is this important? It's important to understand that when the apostles and prophets wrote the New Testament, they were writing with that inclusive counting frame of mind. So in regard to the days that Jesus was dead, we know that the day that he died was counted as the first day. The day he died counts as the first day. The day after he died as the second day, and the next day was the third day. So, counting inclusively, the day of his death is the first day, the day after it is the second day, and the next day is the third day. Alright? Now, the second thing you have to understand is the Jewish calendar. And we don't have to go into this in depth, but we only need to know one thing, which is how did the Jews reckon days? How did they count days? Well, the important thing to know is that the Jews counted days from dusk to dusk, or we would say from evening to evening. Not from midnight to midnight as we do. Now, the reckoning from midnight to midnight, where we say that a 24-hour day runs from midnight to midnight, that reckoning is not illegitimate. That's a legitimate form of reckoning. The Gospel of John actually uses that form of reckoning. But it is a Gentile way of reckoning the day. It is a Roman way of reckoning the day. It is not the Hebrew way of reckoning the day, or the Jewish way. And we can see way back to Genesis chapter 1 that the day begins with the evening. It says an evening was and morning was one day. So the way that the Jewish people count days is from evening to evening. When I say evening to evening, I mean not quite sundown, but a time that is slightly after sundown. Because you see, right when the sun goes down, the atmosphere still reflects the light a little bit. So sundown is not the beginning of the new day. It's actually somewhere, I think it's maybe about 15 minutes or so after sundown is about the marker of when evening begins. Basically, it's the time when natural light sources are no longer sufficient. You know, whenever you might need to light a lamp, and whenever the stars begin to appear in the sky is the beginning of what is actually evening, or another word for that is dusk. That is the beginning of a day in the Jewish reckoning, dusk to dusk, evening to evening. All right, so how does that apply to the time frame of Jesus' death? Jesus died at about 3 p.m. on what we would now call Friday. I don't like those names, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I don't like those names because they come from paganism and the worship of false gods, so I'm only using them as a way of communicating to people that only understand that. So, on the 6th day of the week, which is commonly called Friday in English, Jesus died on that 6th day of the week at about 3 p.m. So in the middle of the afternoon. He was nailed to the cross at about 9 a.m. All right, about 9 a.m. And of course we know that at midday the darkness came over all the land. And that lasted until 3 p.m. So 3 p.m. is when he gave up the ghost and died. So that was in the day. That was daytime, right? 3 p.m. It was not yet evening. So we know that he died 3 p.m. on Friday, and this was the first day that Jesus was dead. Now, when the sun went down at about 6 p.m. on Friday, I say approximately because we all know that there's a little bit of a variation in sundown time, but approximately 6 p.m. On Friday. Well, then, according to the Jewish reckoning, that was the beginning of the next day. You see, the 7th day of the week, according to the Jewish calendar, the Jewish frame of mind, the 7th day of the week doesn't begin at midnight on Friday, it begins at evening on Friday. So when the sun goes down in evening on Friday, that's the initiation of the 7th day of the week. That's the beginning of what we call the Sabbath, right? So that was the beginning of the next day, the Sabbath. So in other words, the Sabbath, which is evening Friday to evening Saturday, that was the 2nd day Jesus was dead. Now the Sabbath ended at about 6 p.m. on Saturday, on our Saturday, about 6 p.m. on Saturday, when it became dark. And that was the beginning of the first day of the week, which was the 3rd day that Jesus was dead. All right? So we've covered the Jewish way of counting, which is inclusive. We've covered how the Jews reckon days from evening to evening. And then third, we want to cover the meaning of the word day in the Bible. Now, according to Genesis 1:5, the word day has two meanings. Genesis 1:5, we see two meanings of the word day. God called to the light day, and to the darkness he called night, and evening was and morning was one day. And so we actually have two usages of the word day in that Genesis 1:5. The first usage we see is that God called to the light day. So in other words, that means a period of light. A period of light is a day. Approximately 12 hours. Jesus says, are there not 12 hours in a day? He says in the Gospel of John. So approximately 12 hours of daylight. So the first meaning of day is it's the period of light. It's the period of daylight. Now, the second meaning of the word day is we see an evening was and morning was one day. That day actually means a period of darkness followed by a period of light, which is a complete 24-hour period. And then we all know that there are other meanings of the word day in the Bible. There's a figurative meaning of the word day that simply means a time period, but that meaning is irrelevant to this particular study. The only relevant meanings of the word day are the fact that it's used of the 12-hour period of light is a day as distinguished from the night, and then also the day and the night together are counted together as a day, a 24-hour day, a full day. All right? Fourth, the Jewish way of counting days. The Jewish way of counting days, which is that the Jews counted a part of a day as a whole day. So this is the fourth thing that you have to understand to understand what's being taught in the New Testament. The Jews counted a part of a day as a whole day. Now we can read this in the Jerusalem Talmud. Now I certainly don't think the Talmud is worth much. Most of it would be better used as toilet paper. However, the Talmud does give us some traditions that preserve interesting information about the first century and tell us many of the customs that shed light on the New Testament. And so there is some important information within the Talmud if you discard the Jewish fables. But in the Jerusalem Talmud, in Shabbat 9:3, it says, quote, a day and a night are a period, and part of a period is like all of it. So, quote, a day and a night are a period, and part of a period is like all of it. So, the Jews counted a part of a day as a whole day. And by a day, we're speaking about a full day, which is a period of darkness followed by a period of light. Any portion, any part of that period was counted as the full period. And so this explains to us now how the expressions in the third day and after 3 days harmonize. As we said, Jesus died about 3 p.m. on Friday. Now, because he was dead for about 3 hours before dusk, for approximately 3 hours before dusk, 3 hours before evening, and part of a day counts for the whole day, those 3 hours before the Sabbath are as one full day. Those 3 hours that he was dead before the evening on the 6th day of the week count as one full day. And then we know that he was dead for the full 24 hours of the Sabbath. He was dead for the full 24 hours of the Sabbath. And that counts for a second day. And then the question is, when did he rise from the dead? Do we know exactly when he rose from the dead? In fact, we do. He rose from the dead about 3 a.m. on what we would now call Sunday, or what is commonly called Sunday. He rose from the dead during the night, at about 3 a.m. on what we would now call Sunday, the first day of the week. Or you say, well, how do you know that? Look at the Gospel of Mark. All we have to do is compare together 3 passages in the Gospel of Mark. Mark 1:35. Now in the morning, having risen a long while before daylight, he went out and departed to a solitary place, and there he prayed. Now do you notice that although it was not yet daylight, although the light had not yet broken in, yet Mark refers to this as the morning, in the morning. All right, now look at Mark 13:35. Watch therefore, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, in the evening, at midnight, at the crowing of the rooster, or in the morning. Now, what's interesting is that in Mark 13:35, Jesus references the 4 watches of the night. Now, what's interesting is whereas we today reckon the night as divided into hours, that was not the way the night was reckoned in the New Testament. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says, "Are there not 12 hours in the day?" But there's never a statement that there are 12 hours in the night. Because in fact, the day was divided into hours, but the night was rather divided into watches. And there were 4 watches of the night. And these 4 watches lasted approximately 3 hours each. 3 hours each. And so the first watch of the night is called the evening. The evening. And that began at about dusk, approximately 6 p.m., and lasted until 9 p.m. At which point the second watch of the night commenced. The second watch of the night was called midnight. And that lasted from 9 p.m. to midnight. Now you say, well, that's curious. You know, it started at 9 p.m. and it ended at midnight, but yet the watch itself is called midnight, the midnight. It's a midnight watch. Why? It's called that because it ends at midnight. So it's actually given the name based upon when the watch ends. Whereas the previous one had the name grounded upon when it begins. All right, now at the crowing of the rooster, Now that watch ended, began at midnight, 12 midnight, and it ended at 3 a.m. At 3 a.m. And that was given the name grounded upon when the rooster crowed. So now you know when the rooster crowed, when Peter, when Peter denied Jesus. All right, now 3 a.m. then, 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. was the watch of the night, which was called the morning watch. Why is it called that? Because it lasted until the onset of the day. It lasted until daybreak, which was the morning. So in fact, there was a watch of the night which was called the morning. Not because it was actually part of the morning, but because it ended with the morning. You see, from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. Now, we read about Jesus praying in the morning, but it says he was praying before the day had broken. So he had risen before daylight, before the sun had come up, and he was praying there in the darkness, in the early, the wee hours, as we would say. So now let's go to Mark 16:9, and we'll see that Mark tells us when Jesus rose from the dead. Now, when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene. So here he tells us that he rose early on the first day of the week. Now, that term early is a term that is used in connection with that fourth watch of the night. And so what I'm saying then is that Jesus Christ rose from the dead at about the beginning of the fourth watch of the night, so approximately 3 a.m. on the first day of the week. So he not only rose from the dead on the first day of the week by Jewish reckoning. See, Jewish reckoning, the first day of the week began at evening Saturday night. But according to Roman reckoning, according to Gentile reckoning, we know that the first day of the week would not begin until midnight, right, on Saturday. Jesus actually rose from the dead about 3 a.m. So whether you're reckoning by Jewish or Gentile reckoning, he still rose from the dead on the first day of the week. And so that time period that he was dead, which was approximately 6 p.m. Saturday night, evening, onset of evening, Saturday night, to 3 a.m. on what we now call Sunday, that period of hours, which was about 9 hours, that is a part of a day that counts for another full day. Another full day. All right, so now we're in a position to answer that question, of course, that we started out with. How long was Jesus dead? Jesus was dead approximately 36 hours. 36 hours is the biblical time frame for how long Jesus was dead. All right, and so Jesus rose both after 3 days and in the third day, according to Jewish thinking. It's not a contradiction, they're both true. Jesus truly rose after 3 days. Why? Because part of the day before the Sabbath was counted as a full day. And part of the day after the Sabbath was counted as a full day. So what I'm saying is, he was dead part of the day, he was dead a full 24 hours, and then he was dead for 9 hours on the third day. But those two partial periods counted as full days. So when he rose from the dead, it could be correctly said he rose after 3 days, since the two portions counted as full days. Thus, Jesus was dead for 3 days, although not for 3 24-hour days. He was dead for 3 days according to the Jewish reckoning of days. But Jesus also rose in the third day, because the day that he died counted as the first day, the Sabbath was the second day, and then the next day was the third. So in other words, I'm saying he rose in the third day and after 3 days, depending upon how you're reckoning the day. They're both true from different perspectives. Now, Matthew 27:63 through 64 shows that the Jewish leaders had the correct understanding. As you would expect that they would, because they knew what Jesus meant when he said after 3 days. Let's look at Matthew 27:63 through 64. Saying, "Sir, we remember while he was still alive, how that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise.' Therefore command that the tomb be made secure until the third day." Now, do you see how they interpret? In verse 63, they say after 3 days, but how do they interpret after 3 days? Until the third day, in verse 64. So they don't say the 4th, because they knew that after 3 days meant that they only had to watch the tomb until the 3rd day, not the 4th. You see, you can't take after 3 days to mean that he's going to rise in the 4th day, because then they would say, well, you need to watch it until the 4th. No, they said until the 3rd, because they understood that after 3 days was equivalent to on the 3rd day. Now, this same understanding is found in the Old Testament, actually. Now, I won't read these passages, but you can study on your own time. Genesis chapter 40, verses 13 through 20. Genesis 42, 17 through 18. Joshua chapter 9, verses 16 through 17. And 1 Kings chapter 20, verse 29. All of those places use this same understanding of reckoning days. But I do want to read a passage which I think is the best passage in the Old Testament to show this, which is 2 Chronicles 10, 5 and 2 Chronicles 10, 12. 2 Chronicles 10, 5. Second Chronicles 10:5 and 2 Chronicles 10:12. Now in 2 Chronicles 10:5 it says, "So he said to them, come back to me after 3 days. And the people departed." So in 2 Chronicles 10:5, Rehoboam commands the people to come back after 3 days. So the question is, did they understand him to mean after 3 full 24-hour periods? And therefore that they should come back on the 4th day? No. Look at chapter 10, verse 12. It says, "So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam on the 3rd day, as the king had directed, saying, come back to me the 3rd day." So in chapter 10, verse 12, they come back to him on the 3rd day, and the passage even adds that the king had said, come back to me on the 3rd day. And did he literally say that? No, he literally said, come back after 3 days. But see, they had the correct understanding within the context of the Israelite people that whenever someone said after 3 days, it was understood that they meant on the 3rd day. That's the correct understanding of after 3 days. So when Jesus said after 3 days, it's meant to understand, well, that doesn't mean three full 24-hour periods. That means on the 3rd day. Okay, now the 4th thing that you have to understand is the Jewish use of idioms. The Jewish use of idioms. Now I bring this up because so far we've reconciled the first 3 expressions. In the 3rd day, in 3 days, after 3 days. All of those things can be understood to be equivalent. But now the question is, what does he mean though in Matthew 12:40 when he says 3 days and 3 nights? So the 4th thing you have to understand is the Jewish use of idioms. You know, not everything in the Bible can be taken literally. We should always interpret the Bible literally unless there is a reason, a contextual reason, or a reason from the rest of Scripture why we cannot take it literally. The Jews had several idiomatic expressions. And one of these idioms that the Jews used in Hebrew, one of the idioms was that they would say a day and a night to mean a day. They'd say a day and a night to mean a day. Why? Because we're talking about how a day and a night, a period of darkness, a period of light, together make up a full day. So instead of just saying a day, they had an idiom, they'd say a day and a night to mean a day. Now we also have idioms in English, such as the one that people quote all the time. They say, it is raining cats and dogs. Now does anybody say that? Nobody really says that. That's what's always funny is that that's used as some kind of illustration, but I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that in real life. It's raining cats and dogs. But anyway. But that's an expression. Okay, Brother William has said it. It is raining cats and dogs. Now, to take such a statement literally would be ludicrous. You know, it's not actually raining cats and dogs. Now, we also say other idioms. We say things like, John kicked the bucket yesterday. He kicked the bucket. Now, are we talking about him kicking the bucket? No, we're talking about him dying. We also say things like, I am all ears. I am all ears. Do we mean that every part of our body is an ear? No, the expression I am all ears means that you're listening. So see, there are idioms, there are expressions, and you have to understand that the Bible contains these too. So when Jesus said in Matthew 12:40 that he would be dead 3 days and 3 nights, it is not meant to be taken literally as a period of 72 hours. Rather, 3 days and 3 nights is simply an idiom meaning 3 days, since a day and a night make a day. And since a part of a day counts as a full day, any portion of time that touches 3 days counts as 3 days and 3 nights. And you know, in English we actually even have a way of speaking that comes near to this, which is if someone works hard at a project, he might say, I worked day and night to finish it. I worked day and night to finish it. Now, in this idiom, the person doesn't mean that he worked a literal 24 hours without stopping, does he? No, but see, that's an expression. I worked day and night to finish it. So, 3 days and 3 nights should not be taken literally. It was simply a Jewish idiom meaning any portion of time that touches 3 days. And so how do we know this? Well, I mean, we do know it, of course, because if we took it literally, it would contradict the other statements. We know that the Bible doesn't contradict itself. And therefore, to bring it into harmony with the other 3 statements, we have to understand 3 days and 3 nights as a figure of speech, as an idiom, not a literal statement. But then here's the other proof. This idiom is found in the Old Testament. So see, this idiom is also found in the Old Testament, just like the others. And so you can look that up yourself. 1 Samuel 30, verse 12, Esther 4:16 through 5:1, and Jonah 1:17. Jonah 1:17. 1 Samuel 30, verse 12, Esther 4:16 through chapter 5, verse 1, and Jonah 1:17. In those passages, we see this very same idiom, 3 days and 3 nights, which is not a literal reference, but simply any period of time which covers or touches upon 3 days can be said to be 3 days and 3 nights. Jesus, and just to reiterate, Jesus being dead for part of the day before the Sabbath, the whole Sabbath, and part of the day after the Sabbath counts as 3 days and 3 nights, because the part of the day before the Sabbath counts for the whole day, both day and night. The Sabbath counts for the whole day, both day and night. And then the part of the day after the Sabbath counts for the whole day, both day and night. Thus you have 3 days and 3 nights. That's 3 days and 3 nights, according to the Jewish reckoning of days. But it is not a literal 72 hours. So, you know, that teaching out there, and you'll run across people that say this, that Jesus was dead for a literal 72 hours. That teaching is mistaken, and it comes from those who do not understand the Jewish context of the statements and the way in which these statements are being made. And they don't even understand it in light of the Old Testament. Because, you know, if someone's going to want to bring up the objection and say, oh, well, you know, I don't regard what the Talmud says, or I don't regard Jewish tradition. Okay, well fine, don't regard it. Pay attention to the Old Testament then. Because I just showed you in the Old Testament where after 3 days is equivalent to on the third day. And so the Old Testament tells you that this way of reckoning was the Israelite way of reckoning days. Okay, so that's the explanation. I think it's an important thing, because you might come across people that have this teaching, this false teaching, say, oh, well, Jesus wasn't crucified on a Friday, he's crucified on a Wednesday. That's not true. That is false. The traditional understanding of what is called Good Friday, that is correct. There's no reason to say that that's not correct. And then I hope this has kind of educated you and helped you understand how long Jesus was dead. That in fact he was dead approximately 36 hours. That's how long, 36 hours. He died 3 p.m. on Friday, and he rose again from the dead about 3 a.m. on what we call Sunday. So he actually rose from the dead before the sun had ever risen and before it had become light on the first day of the week. Now I've got one final statement to make as further proof that the teaching that he was dead for 72 hours must be a false teaching. And that is the prophecy that is given in Psalm 16. Psalm 16. God made a very specific statement about Jesus' resurrection. And that is in Psalm 16:10. He says, "Nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption." Nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. And so, what the prophecy says is that God would not allow Jesus' body to see corruption or to see decay. Rather, he would be raised from the dead before the onset of decomposition. So, we can test this theory that he was dead 72 hours by simply looking into when does decomposition begin? When is the onset of corruption or decay? Well, I looked it up. And this is very interesting. Because do you know when what they call putrefaction begins? Putrefaction begins approximately 36 hours after death. 36 hours after death. Now, give or take, environmental conditions can mean that it can, start slightly after that or a little bit before. But basically, rigor mortis ends at approximately 36 hours after death. And putrefaction then begins at approximately 36 hours. So 36 hours is the beginning of the decomposition stage of the human body after death. I know it's not pretty to talk about, but approximately 36 hours after death, we have the onset of what we now call putrefaction. That is the beginning of decomposition. That is the beginning of what they would call actual rotting of the body. And so what's interesting is Jesus was raised 36 hours after his death, and that is before the onset of putrefaction, before the onset of decomposition. And therefore God's promise was fulfilled, that he did not allow Jesus' body to see corruption. He was raised before putrefaction. As I said, it varies, but it's approximately 36 hours. We know from this prophecy that no doubt, he was raised before that began, right? But in no way could he have been dead for 72 hours and not have seen corruption. That is way too... There is no scenario in which decomposition and the putrefaction which is the technical decomposition. There's no way that he could have been dead 72 hours and that not have already started, and that not have already been going on. And so what I'm saying is the prophecy that he did not see decay, that he did not see corruption, that could not have been fulfilled if he were dead a full 72 hours. So the truth of Scripture is that he was dead about 36 hours, that we must understand these expressions as a part of the day counting as the full day. And of course that's always been the traditional understanding of it. And tradition is not an authority, but maybe sometimes we need to give regard to the things that we've been taught, because, you know, untaught and unstable people, they twist the Scriptures, don't they?
Yes.
All right. So I hope this has been educational and, you know, maybe help you to understand if you ever encounter somebody that is misled or deceived on this issue. Are there any questions?
It had occurred to me that the part where Jesus says that in 3 days and 3 nights, like the other part of that phrase was in the heart of the earth, and that's like an idiom as well. It's not like the earth has a literal beating heart or something, but it's saying in the center of the earth, you know, where Sheol is that kind of what,
yeah,
so
I mean,
there's like two figurative expressions.
Yeah, when he says in the heart of the earth, I mean, we know that that word heart that's figurative language. It's figurative language for the middle of the earth, right? Okay. So yeah, he just used a figure of speech, heart of the earth, right? Mm-hmm. Of course, what it's revealing to us is the truth that that is the actual location of hell. That hell is in fact in the center of the earth. It's actually in the middle of the earth. You know, people say, where is hell? I mean, the Bible always says hell is below, hell is down, you know. There's only one location that can be down no matter where you are on the earth, right? And that's the exact middle of the earth. So, yeah, hell is located in the center of the earth. All right. May the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the communion of the Holy Ghost be with you all.